It comes before the light does. A sound you feel in your chest before your ears can name it. Low, rolling. Somewhere out in the dark, the ground itself seems to be moving toward you. Then the cold. High desert cold, thin and clean, the kind that makes the first breath of the day sharp in your lungs. Sagebrush stretches in every direction, silver gray in the half-light, and when your boot crushes a branch the smell rises dry and resinous and faintly sweet. The sky turns from black to gray to a pale gold that pours sideways across the land. And now the sound has a shape. Hooves. Out of the dust, in that first low light, they come. A line of horses moving fast across open ground, no saddles, no fences. No one calling them home, because there is no home to call them to. The horses in front of you have never been ridden, never been fed by a human hand, never worn a rope. This is one of the last places on earth where you can stand this close to an animal that belongs to absolutely no one. You think you know the American West. The cowboy, the open range, the wild horse galloping into a sunset on a postcard. But the postcard is the surface. Go there, actually go, and stand still inside it, and the West opens into something stranger, quieter, and far more alive than any photograph ever promised. So stay with me, because in the next 20 minutes you are going to learn why the horse in front of you is not a foreigner in America at all, but a native that came home after vanishing for thousands of years. You are going to meet the one who truly leads the herd, and it is not the one you would guess. And you are going to find the single most famous wild horse herd in America, living quietly less than an hour from a city you have almost certainly flown over without a second thought. But first, the desert itself. Nevada is mostly empty in a way that is hard to describe until you are inside it. Most of the state is public land, open country that runs to the horizon and keeps going. Mountains rise out of the flats like islands, bare and rocky, their shadows sliding across the valley floor as the sun climbs. There are no billboards out here, no power lines, just sage, and stone, and a silence so wide you can hear your own pulse in it. This is the country that holds more wild horses than any other state in America. Tens of thousands of them, moving across the open range in family groups, drinking from springs that most maps do not bother to mark. By midday, the light changes everything. The cold is gone. Heat rises off the ground in visible waves, blurring the far mountains into mirage. The horses know this. They do not fight the desert. They read it. They move to higher ground where the grass stays cooler, and they always know where the water is. Out here, water is not a feature of the landscape. It is the center of everything. A single spring can be the reason a herd exists in one valley and not the next one over. Watch them long enough and you stop seeing horses and start seeing a system. A herd that has learned a place so completely it has become part of it. Subscribe to Unseen Countries. Stay close, because in a few minutes we cross into the part of this desert that wildlife photographers wait years to witness, the moment an entire herd turns as one body, and you finally understand who gave the order. Get closer, and the herd stops being a single shape and becomes a society. The wild horses of the West do not roam as loners, they live in tight family bands, and every band has a structure you can read once you know what to look for. There is a stallion, powerful and watchful, circling the edges. There are mares. There are foals, all legs and curiosity, testing their bodies against the open ground, breaking into sudden gallops for no reason at all except that they can. Now, the easy story is that the stallion runs the show. That is what most films will tell you. And it is wrong. Watch what happens when the band moves. When it is time to leave the water, to cross a ridge, to find better grazing before the heat sets in. The stallion is not the one who decides. He fights. He defends. He drives off rivals in clashes of muscle and dust that look like the whole West compressed into 10 seconds. But he is the muscle, not the mind. The one who decides where everyone goes is an old mare. The lead mare, the matriarch, is usually the oldest and most experienced female in the band. She knows the routes. She remembers which spring held water in the worst summer of the last decade. She knows where the wind carries the scent of a mountain lion, and which canyon is a trap. And when she turns, the whole band turns with her, the stallion bringing up the rear. The herd does not follow strength, it follows memory. That is the first thing the desert teaches you that the postcard never could. These animals are not running on instinct alone. They are running on knowledge, passed from one old mare to the next, generation after generation. And here is where it gets stranger. Because that knowledge, the West, the open range, the horse itself has a history far older and far weirder than the cowboy era that made it famous. The horse did not arrive in America with the Spanish. The horse was born here. Millions of years ago, the ancestors of every horse alive today evolved on this continent. They grazed these same kinds of plains. Then, around 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, they vanished from North America completely. Gone. The continent that invented the horse lost it. For thousands of years, this land had no horses at all. Until the ships came. When Spanish explorers crossed the Atlantic, they brought horses back to the very continent where horses had first appeared. Some escaped. Some were set loose. And they spread across the open country of the West with astonishing speed, because in some deep evolutionary sense, they were not invading a foreign land. They were coming home. Stand in front of a wild Mustang and let that settle for a moment. You are not looking at a feral runaway. You are looking at a native species that disappeared from its own birthplace and then returned. The most American of all the symbols of the West is, quite literally, a homecoming. And it gets even better, because the next part involves people. For a long time the story went that native peoples of the West received the horse only after Europeans pushed deep into the continent, but research that pairs genetics with indigenous oral tradition tells a different story. Studies suggest that horses spread north through indigenous trade networks and were woven into the cultures of the plains and the West earlier than the old textbooks claimed that the horse and the people had already found each other, before the Europeans ever arrived in that country. As one Comanche historian put it, his people always said they met the horses before they met the Spanish. For a long time, no one with a microscope listened. Now the science is catching up to the story that was told around fires for generations. For those nations, the horse was never just transportation. It was mobility, freedom, a new way of moving through the world. It reshaped entire ways of life. And the descendants of those horses are the same animals breathing in front of you, on the same ground, under the same enormous sky. Which raises a question. If wild horses are this woven into the land, this old, this free, why are there still any left at all? The honest answer is that for a while, there almost were not. And the reason there are, is, improbably, one woman. Her name was Velma Johnston, and she was a secretary in Reno, Nevada. One morning around the middle of the last century, driving to work, she found herself behind a truck. The truck was dripping blood onto the road. She followed it, and what she found at the end of that drive changed the rest of her life. Wild horses, rounded up off the range, headed for slaughter to be turned into pet food. She could have looked away. She did the opposite. She started a campaign that most people thought was hopeless. She gave it everything. And here is the detail that stays with you. She enlisted schoolchildren. Thousands of them wrote letters to Congress about the wild horses. So many letters arrived that they became part of the story themselves. They called her Wild Horse Annie, and it stuck. It worked. Her campaign led to a federal law protecting these animals on public lands. The simple, almost unbelievable truth is this: the reason you can stand in the Nevada desert today and watch a wild herd gallop past, free, is in large part because one woman refused to forget what she saw on that road. Now, the most famous of all these herds is not deep in some unreachable wilderness, it is hiding in plain sight. Drive less than an hour from Reno, into a stretch of high country called the Virginia Range, and you enter what many consider the best place in the entire West to see wild horses up close. Roughly 500 square miles of rolling desert between Reno and Carson City, dotted with bands that have grown used to being watched, though never tamed. These hills have a strange kind of fame. This is the range where the film The Misfits was shot, the one with Marilyn Monroe and Clark Gable, a story that turned, of all things, on the fate of wild Mustangs. So when you stand here, you are standing in a landscape that has been a stage, a symbol, and a sanctuary all at once. Come at dawn, and you might find a band grazing on a ridge, backlit, breath steaming in the cold. The foals will notice you first. The lead mare will lift her head, read you, decide you are not a threat, and go back to the grass. You will be close enough to hear them tear at the sage, close enough to hear the soft sounds they make to each other, a low language of snorts and nickers that keeps the band together. And then something will spook them, a scent on the wind, a shadow, And in a single instant the whole band turns and pours down the slope as one animal, hooves drumming, dust rising gold in the low sun, manes and tails streaming. It lasts a few seconds. It is the most alive thing you will ever see. Then they stop. They look back at you. And the desert goes utterly silent again, that enormous high country silence, as if nothing had happened at all. That is the thing no photograph can give you, not the gallop. The silence after it. The way a place this empty can hold something this full of life, and then fold back into stillness like a held breath. People come from all over the world for this. They stand on these ridges at sunrise with cameras and with nothing at all, just to watch animals that answer to no schedule, no owner, no fence. And almost everyone leaves changed in a small, hard-to-name way. Because somewhere along the way, watching them, you stop thinking about horses. You start thinking about what it actually looks like when something is free. Not free as a word on a flag. Free as a living body, deciding for itself which way to run, following an old mare's memory across a land that remembers it too. The last thing you see, as you turn to leave, is the herd already smaller against the hills, the matriarch leading them up toward higher ground, the foals trailing behind. They do not look back this time. They were here long before you arrived, in a deeper sense than you ever imagined. They will be here after you go. And you carry it down the mountain with you, that image, that silence. You came to see horses. You leave having seen something the West has been trying to tell us for 10,000 years. Free is not a word out here. It is a thing you can watch breathe. So here is the question worth taking home. When was the last time you stood somewhere that answered to no one and felt it answer back? If you want to keep finding places that change how you see the world, subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you on Unseen Countries.